Can you hear me? Yeah. Awesome. Somebody just noticed I brushed my hair. I want to share a quick story. A couple decades ago, in my first or second year teaching, I had what our society would call the stereotypical nightmare student, teenager student. And she was surly. She threw things at people. She questioned every single assignment that I gave. And I'm pretty certain that she flipped me off every time I turned to the whiteboard. I even pulled her desk attached to her chair out of the classroom one day and had her sit in the courtyard so that she could look into the class that she just lost the privilege of attending. And we eventually found our way. But fast forward about 10 years or so, and I'm teaching up here in San Francisco, and I took a group of students to see a nonprofit that was doing some really successful things with some marginalized populations. And I walked into the front office, and there she was. And she had started the nonprofit. She was running it, and she had about 50 employees underneath her. A force, really. And I bring this up because I think that we do a real disservice to not just teenagers, but to ourselves when we focus so much on these stereotypes. And if we were to pay attention to what society tells us about teens, right? I mean, they wouldn't have time to eat or sleep, or much less study, because they're way too busy rolling their eyes, breaking rules, having sex, doing drugs, and texting all at the same time. And so I want to take a few minutes to look at some of these stereotypes and annoying behaviors that people like to talk about with teens. And I want to sort of look at their flip side. There are some hidden strengths in there that I think it's nice to take a few moments to look at. Because what I would suggest is that what drives us the most crazy and is the most annoying about teen behavior is exactly what we love or will love about them in the future. Not just that, but what we will count on in them in the future. So let's look at a couple. They make stupid choices. And they do. And they do it with this really amazing, confidence. I sort of admire it. I bumped into a student of mine just a few weeks ago in the hallway, and we've been texting back and forth about some pretty important issues, and I hadn't heard back from her. So I went up to her and I said, I hadn't heard from you. And she said, I don't have a phone. And I said, well, so what's up? She's like, well, I had a fight with my parents last Thursday, and so I ran away. And but then I found out that minors can't get into motels on their own. So then I decided I'd camp out at the beach, and then I called my boyfriend, and we got in a fight, and so I buried the phone. Don't have it. And that's just one day. And I said, so I said, are you going to get another one soon? She's like, yep, saving up. Walked away. So we don't need to sugarcoat this. I mean, it is true. They actually did, some scientists did an experiment with a bottle of Drano years ago, and they took a kid about 5 years old, and they took a 15-year-old, and they took a 28-year-old. And they put a bottle of Drano up there and asked them if they would drink it. And then they timed their responses. Honestly. Yeah. 5-year-old said no. 28-year-old, about the same response time. 15-year-old. It's really Drano? And what are we talking like this much? Are we talking like the whole thing? And you got any money? Do I get anything for it? And I say this because you know all the neurobiology now, and of course, the brain develops from back to front, and so all of those impulses and desires and emotions and fight or flight is all done, and of course, that part that does executive functioning isn't quite finished. And so that does play into it, but I want to look at the flip side. We need a population that keeps us in check. We really need people watching us that challenge us when we decide what is so. And teenagers are really good at that. We really need somebody when we say, I have no idea why you just made that decision, to hear, I just wanted to see what would happen. I mean, that's a really, really important trait. So I'm not saying that we need to, bust open the Drano for everybody and put it out where everybody can reach it. But I do think that we need consistent questions. And Mike Riera, who's just an amazing educator, has a great quote where he says, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. And I think those are really wise words. I also think that we have to remember that for every stupid choice a teenager makes, they make a dozen really informed, perceptive whys. So, another one. They know everything. They got it all figured out. And in a sense, they do know everything. They know enough. Because they now know enough to know that we don't have it all figured out and we don't know everything. And that's a lot to know. So by about 12 years old, an adolescent is smart enough to actually envision the concept of what a perfect parent or adult looks like, and we're not it. So that could be a real buzzkill when you thought so far that the people that were in charge actually knew what they were doing all the time. So I say this because posturing is a really good coping mechanism when you're just beginning to know how much you don't know. It is. So here's a good one. No impulse control. Okay. So I had a student in the fall. I already checked in with him about this, make sure it was okay. And who, despite all of his amazing good intentions, he couldn't shut up. I mean, he couldn't. He would raise his hand, but as he was talking, sort of just like in a, choreography. He interrupted everybody. Out of control. And it's an 80-minute class. So at one point, I literally threatened to put duct tape on his face. And we both knew I wouldn't do it. Yeah. But while the rest of the class was giggling about this, he and I made eye contact. And in a really tender moment, we knew that both of us would have been relieved if I'd been able to pull it off. I say this because, and what they're doing is they really are building a brain, and they're so sick of this comment, but it's really worth just noting that really quickly. Check this out. All this is done, right? While they're managing all this part of their brain, their energy is going back and forth. Whenever there's a dull moment, they're up here trying to build all this executive, logical, I love this, appropriate social emotion. What does that even mean? I say this because basically that means that there might as well be on the prefrontal cortex a sign that says back in 10. Because you can't be doing that's a big job, right? And so what's really cool about that is that the same kid that's got a garbage can on his best friend's head for the 5th time, if I wait 10 minutes, that's going to be the same kid who raises his hand and says, Charis, I've been thinking about this fact that I want my parents to admire and respect me so much, and I'm trying to figure out who I am, and I'm constantly worried that those two things are going to cancel each other out. Same kid. So, don't respect authority. That's a good one. And face it, we haven't given them an enormous amount to work with here, so I feel like we need to toss it a bone. But there's a couple flip sides to this. We want our youth, definitely, to develop a fine-tuned, healthy distrust in anyone who has power over them. It's important. But here's another thing. I often confuse disrespect with a developing, honest, open opinion. And I think those two can get confused quite often. I had a 10th grade girl once when we were doing a lesson that I was very proud of. And in the middle of it, she looked up at me and she said, this is really stupid. I was like, ow. And after I got over my brief moral outrage and my bruised ego, I realized that she was coming from a place of real respect. She was giving me honest feedback, not gracefully, but that's a fine dance. And what's so fascinating to me about the awesomeness that are teens is that they've let go of one tree limb of a reality that they've inherited from their parents, from their teachers, from their church. And they haven't yet grasped on to the next tree limb that's the reality that they're creating and learning for themselves. So they're in a sort of free fall. And being graceful in a free fall is next to impossible. So that's why I always cut students slack that will raise their hand in class and say, I don't know if what I'm about to say is rude or precocious in sort of an impressive and daring kind of way. So they mess up. Thank God they mess up. We are right now in an epidemic of this unsustainable pursuit of perfect right now. And if we combine that with this narrowing definition of how we're defining success, teenagers can pretty much feel like a failure a dozen times a day. We're filling our kids' heads with so much intellectual assertiveness, so much academic knowledge, and we're not doing enough of giving them those coping skills, the emotional assertiveness, the tools that they're going to need to navigate in that minefield that we're putting them out into. And we know that a key tool to success is failure. We know that, but we don't teach it very well. And we know that the ability to cope when things don't go exactly the way you need them to will serve you so much better than a 4.0 or a high SAT. We know that, but we don't teach it well. And I'm not saying we need to encourage teenagers to celebrate their failures, although I am encouraging them to do that. What we need to do is we need to tell them when they mess up that they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Because if we don't do that, we're nurturing and we're creating marchers, not explorers. And we don't need any more marchers. So, my heart breaks over the growing number of perfect and successful on the outside, broken on the inside, teenagers who are afraid to take even the tiniest risk because they might mess up. So, they don't communicate and they're moody. Can we relate to that at all? I sometimes even have a teenager come in the morning and say, I'm even annoying myself right now, so don't even bother calling. And this gets back to their realization, though, that we don't know necessarily what the hell we're doing, so they're sort of in a mourning process, and so that adds to the moodiness. But becoming a whole human being is a really big job, and it takes a toll. The flip side, they are developmentally doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. In the individuation process, you know, a small child, when they're faced with a conflict or they're scared or frightened or confused, they're going to go to their parents, and then maybe a teacher, and then a friend. Well, in this process of adolescence, teenagers are in this masterful process of flipping that around. When they're in that same state, often they'll go to a peer first, then a mentor or a teacher, and then perhaps their parents, generally speaking. And so what we need to do is we need to put people in place. And it doesn't have to be us. It doesn't have to be mom or dad. It doesn't have to be the teacher. But enough people in place that reflect the values that we're hoping that we can instill in them, so that when they do feel an emotion or want to communicate, there are people there. Because they'll come. They'll come. And finally, I think that often, very often, teenagers want to communicate. They do want to communicate, but we shut them down. And we don't do it because we don't love them. And we don't do it even consciously sometimes. We do it because we're coming from a place of fear that we're not naming. And, I mean, we're afraid they're going to die. Pretty much every day. Like, I come home from work. Literally, I come home from work some days, and I see, like, my two children doing their homework at the kitchen counter, and at times I'm genuinely surprised to see them still there. I'm like, oh my God, another day. Well, Cross your fingers for tomorrow. And it's true. And so often, despite all of our good intentions, when our youth ask us to give them information, we give it to them in a very controlled and censored way. Very controlled and censored. And by doing that, A, we don't serve them at all, right? But B, why are we surprised when they reciprocate in the same way? When they communicate with us in a controlled and censored way? So, last but not least, they're lazy, right? And, again, every stereotype comes from somewhere. I have a couch in my classroom on one side of the wall. And I have an ethical lesson that I do often where I say an ethical statement, and my students need to move to one side of the room if they agree and another side if they disagree. And I have to make my classroom work so that the couch is not on either side of the room that they're going to, but back here, because they will change their ethical stance on the topic so that they can sit down. But here's the deal. They've earned it. They've earned it. First, we have evolution working against us. Did you know that adolescents, teenagers, back in the cave people days, their job was to keep the fire going all night, to keep their clan alive? So I don't know when we came up with the school schedule, but Johnny's not going to come bounding out of his bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, all chipper and glowy. So we got that counting against us. But more than that, they are tired because they are overprogrammed and over-facilitated to the 100th degree these days. They have their SAT tutor, they have their violin lessons, they have soccer practice, they have homework, they have to solve global warming by Monday for community service credit. I call this the unique and special myth. And students coming up to me constantly saying, do you think if I do this I'm unique and special enough? And if everyone around you is pursuing unique and special, then the drive to stop trying is pretty seductive. And so a student recently said to her mother, could we add nothing to our list of activities for the week? It's a pretty perceptive comment. So here's what I find super important to remember when we are faced with the teenager who won't get off the couch, is that every minute of every day, teenagers are trying to figure out how to take care of themselves in their external world, while with their hearts and their brain are trying to develop their internal world. Really. And if there was a Nobel Prize for endurance and bravery and multitasking, teens have us beat. I mean, hands down. So I try to let my students fall asleep sometimes in class, or I let my own kids play the same YouTube video over and over of that cat falling off the kitchen counter because they've earned it. Okay, so in closing, getting back to why teenagers really are our heroes, we need to remember that they're our heroes because they come from a place of unbelievable courage. Courage that adults simply can't sustain, in that they defiantly take the entire world in at once. They stare at the sun. They walk to the edge of the cliff and look over the other side. They ask questions they know that they're not going to like the answers to. And I stopped doing that a long time ago. So, in the end, I mean, they really are just amplified versions of ourselves, aren't they? I mean, it's not complicated, I often say. It's not complicated, it's just hard. They're amplified versions of ourselves at both our best and our worst. Our most authentic selves that we've actually lost along the way for good and bad reasons. And I think that annoys us, but I think it scares us even more. And so, despite the challenges and the contradictions and all the annoying parts of being a teen that we have to deal with, we need to remember that we are, at the core, exactly the same. I mean, teenagers are confused and nervous about some very important choices they're making. They are worried about letting down the people whom they admire and respect the most. And most of all, more than anything in the world, and this is regardless of gender or age with the young people I work with, they want to be assured they're going to be loved for who they are and who they're becoming, more than, and rather than, how well they perform. And so, again, not rocket science, not complicated, just hard. I really think that if we could just grease the metaphorical runway and put up some awesome guardrails and get out of the way, teenagers, we have an enormously bright future in teenagers. And so that's why when people say, okay, so you work with teenagers on purpose? And I say, I do. And it is an honor that I will never, ever take for granted. Thank you.